The Beggar Who Tested His Heart, a true-to-life story script. Imagine giving away the very last coin in your pocket to a stranger who looked like he had nothing left to lose. Now imagine that single act of kindness would decide the rest of your life. This is exactly what happened to a young man named Thomas Hale, and by the time you finish hearing his story, I promise you'll never look at a stranger the same way again. Long ago, in a small, lively town tucked between rolling hills, there lived a young man named Thomas Hale. Everyone in town knew his face before they knew his name, because Thomas had that kind of presence. His thick, dark curls framed a warm, honest face, and his deep hazel eyes always seemed to carry a quiet kindness in them. But behind that charming smile was a truth Thomas rarely spoke of out loud. He was poor. His father had once been a brave army captain, but he had died when Thomas was still a boy, leaving behind nothing but a few worn books and an old sword. There was no family fortune waiting for him, no comfortable inheritance to fall back on. So Thomas worked. He worked hard, and he worked often. First as a clerk for a fabric merchant, then as an assistant to a wine trader. But no matter how many hours he poured into these jobs, success always seemed to slip just out of reach. His paychecks were thin, his savings even thinner, and yet, despite having so little, there was one place in his life where Thomas felt endlessly wealthy. His love for a young woman named Grace Whitfield. Grace was the beautiful daughter of Colonel Whitfield, a respected and well-off military officer. Thomas had fallen for her the very first moment he saw her, completely and without hesitation. He admired the way she carried herself, the sharpness of her mind, the warmth of her heart. The two of them spent countless afternoons together, walking along quiet paths, talking for hours about nothing and everything at once. Anyone who saw them together could tell that their affection ran deep, but there was one enormous obstacle standing between Thomas and the woman he loved, and that obstacle had a name: Colonel Whitfield. The colonel did not approve of Thomas, not because he doubted his character, but because he doubted his bank account. One afternoon, when Thomas came to visit, the colonel finally confronted him face to face. "Thomas," the colonel said firmly, "you are a fine young man, but you have no money. My daughter cannot marry a man with empty pockets. Come back to me when you can prove you have 20,000 pounds to your name." Thomas felt his heart drop straight into his stomach. He loved Grace with everything in him, yet he had no realistic way of gathering a fortune like that. In truth, he barely had a few coins jingling in his pocket. Still, his love for Grace gave him something stronger than money ever could: the determination to find a way, no matter how impossible it seemed. Desperate and unsure, Thomas turned to his closest friend, a talented painter named James Cole. James was well known throughout the town for his skill with a brush, and wealthy families paid handsomely for his portraits. One evening, Thomas visited James at his small, cluttered studio. "James, I don't know what to do," he admitted, his voice heavy with defeat. "I love Grace more than anything, but her father says I need 20,000 pounds before he'll ever let us marry. How am I supposed to find that kind of money?" James thought for a long moment before answering gently, "It's a hard situation. I won't pretend otherwise. But maybe there are other ways to prove your worth." At that very moment, James was in the middle of painting a portrait of an old beggar who had been hired to sit as his model for a small fee. James worked tirelessly at his canvas, carefully capturing the deep sorrow etched into the old man's face. Thomas couldn't help but notice how genuinely miserable the man looked. "Why does he seem so sad?" Thomas asked, studying the beggar closely. James answered without looking up from his work. "That sadness in his eyes is exactly what makes this painting valuable. People want to feel something when they look at art, real emotion, real depth. A cheerful face wouldn't sell nearly as well." Thomas nodded slowly, though something about the answer left him uneasy. "But what does he get for sitting there for hours on end?" James glanced at the old man and shrugged casually. "A shilling an hour. It's not much, but it adds up for him. Meanwhile, my painting will sell for thousands." Thomas was stunned. "Thousands? And he only earns a shilling?" James smiled, unbothered. "That's simply how it works. The artist creates the masterpiece, the model gets a small wage, and the buyer pays for the finished work, not for the person who sat behind it." Something inside Thomas began to stir. He couldn't shake the feeling that this arrangement was deeply unfair, that the old beggar was giving away his time and his dignity for pennies, while James walked away with a small fortune for his talent alone. Watching the old man sit there in his tattered, threadbare clothes, Thomas felt a wave of compassion wash over him. Without a second thought, he reached into his pocket and pulled out the very last money he owned, a single pound, all he had left in the world. He walked over to the old beggar and quietly placed it into his worn hat. "You need this more than I do," he said softly, his heart heavy but certain. The old man looked up in disbelief, his tired eyes widening at the sight of the coin. "Thank you, sir. Truly, thank you. You have no idea what this means to me," he whispered. Thomas offered a small, humble smile, though he felt a flush of embarrassment. "It's nothing. I hope it helps." Just then, James walked back into the room and caught the tail end of the exchange. He raised an eyebrow. "Thomas, what did you just do?" "I gave him my last pound," Thomas admitted, a little sheepish. "He needed it more than I did." James went quiet for a moment. "You gave away everything you had?" Thomas nodded. "I couldn't just walk away knowing he needed it that badly." That night, Thomas went to see Grace, unable to stop thinking about the old man and the sorrow in his eyes. "I gave my last pound to a beggar today," he confessed softly. "It couldn't help it. He needed it more than I did." Grace looked at him, startled. "But, Thomas, you can't just give away all your money like that. What will we do if you have nothing left?" Thomas sighed. "I know, but it didn't feel right keeping that pound while he had nothing at all." Grace's expression softened. "I understand. You have such a good heart, Thomas. But you have to think about our future. My father will never approve of a marriage to a man without means." The next day, Thomas met with James again, and this time his friend could barely contain his excitement. "Thomas, I have news for you," James said. "You are not going to believe this." Thomas looked at him, confused. "What is it?" "I finished that portrait of the old beggar," James explained. "And guess what happened? He started asking me about you. He wanted to know everything, your life, your work, and especially about Grace." Thomas frowned. "Why would he care about any of that?" James grinned. "Because it turns out that old beggar was never just a model. He was hired by Grace's father. He was there to test you." Thomas's eyes went wide with shock. "Grace's father? Why would he do that?" James nodded. "Exactly what it sounds like. Colonel Whitfield wanted to see what kind of man you truly were, even with nothing to your name. He wanted to know if you were worthy of his daughter." Thomas stood frozen, stunned by the revelation. "So, this whole time, he was watching me?" James laughed. "He was. And because of your kindness toward that old man, Grace's father has given his blessing for the marriage." Thomas could hardly believe what he was hearing. His heart pounded with pure joy. "I'm going to marry Grace." James laughed again. Your kindness proved you were exactly the kind of man she deserves." Thomas ran straight to Grace's home and told her the incredible news. She was overjoyed, tears of happiness filling her eyes. "Thomas, you did it. You've earned my father's approval." Thomas smiled, his heart overflowing. "I did it for you, Grace. You mean everything to me." Not long after, Thomas and Grace were married, and they built a life together filled with love, laughter, and endless joy. As for the old beggar, his life changed too. With the colonel's help, he found steady, honest work and never had to live in poverty again. Thomas's generous heart had changed more than one life that day, and he never forgot the lesson it taught him. Kindness is worth more than any fortune, and love is always worth fighting for.